Hello again, welcome to video number 8, which is the last video for this video series for database course, database design course. In the previous video, we learned how can we, as you can see here, we learned how can we fetch the data from the database and we automatically dynamically display them in a table format, and how can we insert a new record to our database table that we have table students. We can insert a new students, and then here we have, as you can see here, these are the students. This is the database that we are using, TMF2034, and this is a table students that we are fetching the everything dynamically and we are displaying in our UI. And then this is for today's video, what we are going to do, let's say if we want to delete a specific record, how can we do it via the UI, via HTML, and then we are going to create a form for that one, and also we are going to learn how can we update a specific record. Let's say if you want to update the intake here or maybe an email, then we need to create another form to update it. And then the objective also for the slides, as you can see here, delete the particular data and update it, and then use the HTML form. Let's go ahead. Firstly we go, okay, now this is the code that we have been doing, and then we work on the previous video. You can check, like we have a H3, this is for displaying the students. We have another section for register, and then this is the config that we are writing all our queries in here. Now let's go ahead, we create another, I will just create another H3. Here I'm just gonna say, let's say we just say delete a record. Delete a record, and of course we need to have a form. Your form, it is good if you assign a name to the form. We can just say delete record or delete, let's say delete record. And what method we are going to use? We use the post method. And of course when you want to delete, you need to have you can see here the MySQL, PHP MySQL delete data. The syntax is delete from which table, which is the students, and then where you need to specify the column, which column that you want. So for our case, we are going to use the student ID, which is a primary key and unique to every student. So we need to create a form to access. You need to have an input that get the student ID in text. You can say student ID, and then the placeholder also we just say student ID, and then we need to have another input type submit, and then the name I'm just gonna say delete, let's say delete, okay, delete, and then the value is delete. Why I'm using the different names, like it is always good to check. Right now I will show you the reason. Now as you can see, we have two different forms. We have a form register form, we have another form delete record. So anytime when you press the submit of delete, now let's go ahead, we check it. We have a form delete. Let's say we want to delete number 7, we just press number 7 and then we press delete. What will happen? We have error like student name, email, intake here, and then what is this, and then why we have these errors. Now when we go back to our code, you can see here we are having an if condition that we are checking the request method from the server if it is post. So it doesn't matter, we are having two forms that both of them are using the post method. But when you go, it will be executed automatically when you press the button for the delete and also for register. So this line will be executed. This is for registration. So we need to differentiate between the two forms. Which one is using the delete, which one is using the register. So if you want to differentiate, you can use another if condition. For example, we write the if condition. Let's say this if condition is used only for like a register. If you want to register a new student, we use here. And then PHP has a function isSet. the isSet, it will check. For example, now we have a post method, and then we can check what is the name of the button that we are using. The name is submit. Here we are checking the submit. If it's set the submit, and then we can write else if, or maybe we can write another if condition, but yeah, just let's go ahead. And then this one, the name of the button that we have is delete. Now we just say a delete, and then here we are going to say echo or like delete, just to check. Now we have two different conditions. We check if we are registering a new student or if we are deleting a student. Now when we refresh, you can see here we are deleting. Now this one will not execute. The register new students will not execute because here we are differentiating between the forms. Here it is used for the register a form, and then this one is for deleting a form. Now, and here when we write print r, let's say we use the print r post, a post, empty post array, you can see here we do have a student ID number 7. Now we are having a ID, we are receiving the ID from the form. Now we can pass this ID to our SQL and then to our function, and then we just delete directly in our table. Let's go ahead in the config. Here we need to create another function. Let's say I'll create another function. We just say let delete record, and then we just say function delete record, and then here of course we need to receive a student ID, and then I'm just gonna global the connection, and then we are going to have a SQL. We need to write our query. So what is our query that we have? Delete from table students, where what is the column name is student ID, where student ID equals to student ID. The syntax you can check here, delete from some column and some value. You can go ahead and check here, delete from guest, where the ID equals to 3, but here we are receiving the ID, student ID. Now there is a problem. We need to call this function. Here we need to call this function delete record. Okay, we have a delete record. We are calling the function delete record, but then now we need to pass the student ID. So the ID we can just grab it from the post method, the array, and the name of the value is student ID. You can see here I just store the ID inside this variable, and then we just simply pass the ID. Now our function receives the ID. We send the ID to the function, and then here we receive it. We are checking the ID, and then we are executing our query. Then after that, what we do, we just gonna check again. I'll just copy the same thing. You can go ahead, you can see here we can just do the same thing, but it's all the same. You can see here what will happen. A record deleted successfully, this one, an error occurred, for example, and then we just don't need the SQL, and we are okay. This sounds fine. The same thing here. We just, let's not use it and make it easier. So what will happen here? We have a Now what will happen here? We have a query. This is our query, and then we are checking our query if our connection. Now we have a connection, the query SQL. We are executing this query, and if the query executes successfully, we say a record deleted successfully, If we get an error, we said an error has been occurred or occurred, and then here we are displaying the error. Now let's go ahead. Firstly we have a student number 8. Let's go ahead, we put the student number 9. We don't have any record number 9. We see like delete, you see an error occurs, check the manual conversion of a delete from student 9 at line 1. So we do not have any number 9. So what we can do, we can delete a student number, let's say 7. Now when we press delete, you can see here, okay, let me refresh, the student number 7, delete from students where student ID equals to 7. Okay, it is server version, right syntax, delete from a student's ID equals to 7. And as I check, you can see here we have a delete, so I need to make sure it is delete. You can see here delete, so I missed an E. Now again, when I go back here, we refresh from the beginning, we want to delete number 7. Just press number 7 and delete. You can see a record has been deleted. Number 7 has been deleted. Now if we want to add it again, we can just add jobber, and then you can see here it's been added. You can delete it again. Let's say delete number 8 and then delete. Number 8 has been deleted. So the idea is like you have to make sure that you are going to use a unique ID, which is our primary key, which is the student ID, to specify which row that we are going to delete. Now our delete is working, our register new students working, and then we are displaying everything successfully in our UI. Now even here, when we go back, select all from students, you can see student number 8 Julia has been deleted. But now let's say if you want to update a record, for example, now if you want to update the intake here or the email, how can we do that one? So that's why we are going to use the same strategy, same thing. We create another form to update the student, and then what we do, we just access it in our config in our the PHP. What we do, we create another form to update, and then after that we just access the records, everything in our function. Let's go ahead, we create a function, here we just say update a record. We create another form, and then we just say form, the name we just say update record, then the method is also post method. Now we need to update. So what are the fields that we can have? If you want to, like for example, sometimes you just want to update a specific data, a specific record or column. So for example, you want to update only this one, but like in the, like for example, what we do, first thing, right now we have 4 columns, 4 inputs. So first thing, let's create all the inputs. We say input type a text, the name is student ID, and then the placeholder is also student ID, Then we have an input type, another text for the first name, let's say fname. Fname, is it first name, is student name, we can just say student name, and then the placeholder is student name, and then the third one is email address, we can say is also a text, or we can say, what do we use here, all use text in the previous, okay, student email, the placeholder we just say student email. We do have in another text, the name we can say intake here, the placeholder we can say intake year, and the last one is our submit button. submit, the type is submit. Now we need to give another name. We just say update, the value is update. Now we have three different forms. You can see a form for update, a form for delete, a form for register. And one thing, all of them, they have a one submit button, but we have different names: update, delete, and this is a submit. We can choose here as a register, but let's change this to register. Now what will happen, we have our form is created. Let me add some BR here just to have some space at the end. You can see here, so it's easier to check. Now we have our form. We just say, for example, now we want to update, let's say number 3 Gary. We say number 3, the student name we want to change, like for example, let's say Gary C, or for example Gary, okay, just say, or maybe G. Then the email we say gary@hotmail.com. we update everything, and then the intake here we just say 2020. The name we can say, okay, Gary, something like this. Now when we click update, nothing is happening. Why? Because here we click on the method, we click on the update button, it sends to the PHP, and then PHP checks this one first. Is the post method okay? Then PHP check, we do not have any we do not receive anything from register, we do not receive anything from delete, so we can write a new one, a new if condition for the update. We can say this is the update, then we just say update if everything, if someone is using the update. Let's print R the post, and then we see what do we get. If we have an update, if we have a delete, if we have a register. Now let's go ahead, and then I will refresh again. You can see here we have a ID 3, the name is Gary George, and then the Gary@hotmail.com and 2020. So we are receiving everything from that form. And then what we do the same thing here we did. We can store everything in the variables, and then we send it to our function update record. We create the function, let's say function update record, and then here we have our global connection, and then we write our SQL query. But then first thing, let's go ahead and then we just we call this function, and then we pass the parameters to this function here. Now we call the function, but we need to send the parameters. What are the data that we have? We have an ID. Okay, we have our ID, which is, you can see here, post. I will just copy this section because we need to duplicate it. We have an ID, we have name, the name, and then we do have email, we do have intake. These are the updated one. And then what are the form inputs? You can just take it, copy from the form directly, like this, student ID, and then you just paste it here. But I already have everything here, it's easier. Student email, student name, the intake here, the intake here. Now everything, we have everything in the variables. What we do, we just send the variables like ID to the function with name and the email, and the last one is intake. So we send the 4 different variables to this function, and the other side we need to have also the 4 parameters. You can see ID, name, email, and intake. So now we are receiving everything. Now we want to update, so let's see what is the update query. And okay, we have an update. Let's go ahead, update data. You can see here update table name, set the column 1, column 2, column 3. Right now we have 4 different columns: student name, ID, email, and intake here. But let's say sometimes someone wants to update only their intake here, so they just want to update the intake here. Someone just want to update the name, someone wants to just update the email. So in your query you need to write something like, for example, an if condition. You select everything from your table, and then what you do, you check the condition whether they want to update only the ID or they want to update the name. So you have to double check everything, so do not update all your table. But for us, we have a small records. We have only 7 records, and then we have only 4 columns, which is quite small. But in the good practice, it's like you need to check where they're going to update the table. But now we just go ahead, we just update everything from ID, the name, email, and intake. So you can see here the same thing, that update the table name is my guest, and then set the column to this one, and then continue to updating everything. So for us, we are going to update the table is students, and then let me check, is it students? Yes, it is students. And then we have a set. What is the column name that we have? We have a ID, student ID. We have a student ID. Let's say what is the ID is ID. And then the second column we are going to update, which is the student name, std name. This is the student name. And then the update version is, you need to specify, because this is a describe students. You can see here this is a varchar, so we need to put it in the single quote and name. Then the next one we have email, which is the column name is student email. Student email equals to single quote, which is again another varchar. And the last one we have our intake here. We have our intake here, which is equals to intake. Now we have our query. You can see here we are going to update it. Now when you write echo, you can echo our query. You can just say echo SQL just to check. We are not going to execute. I refresh it firstly. You can see update the students, set student ID to 3, a student name to Gary George, a student email to this one, and intake here. But there is something problem with this query, because the PHP and MySQL, they do not know where do you want to update it. So you need to specify the column, so the ID, so the student ID is number 3. Okay, now here we are going to say where a student ID, is it like that? Yes, student ID equals to ID. Now here what happened? Student ID equals to 3. I will just delete our query, this echo, execute the, let's execute it, the same code. If our connection and the query executed successfully, we just say a record updated successfully, and if we have an error, we just say an error has been occurred. Right now you can see here Gary is number 3, Gary at Gmail, and then 2018. Now when we refresh, what will happen? The update, a record updated successfully. Then the Gary number 3 has been changed to Gary George, Gary at Hotmail, and 2020. Again, you can update the same thing, like number 3, let's say number 3. Let's say we change to Gary again, and then Gary at Hotmail, the same thing, 2020. Update, you can see here the name get back to the original. Now when we check our table, select all from students, you can see here Gary and then Gary at Hotmail 2020. Let's say if you want to update another record, you do the same thing. For example, number 6 Anita, let's change the intake here to 2019. Number 6, the name is Anita at, let's say, yahoo.com, and then 2018. Let's update. Then what will happen? It will change to Yahoo and then 2018. Here we also received a record successfully updated. You can see here right now in the previous videos we learned how to create tables based on the ERD, and then we have like 4 tables like course, enrollment, lecturer and students. And then what we did, we used the table of students to display everything in our UI. We display all the students that we have, and then we are able to register a new students via the form. We are able to delete them, we are able to update them. The purpose is like for us to understand how can we execute PHP and MySQL via our UI directly. You can see here we created the file, HTML file that we have. Here in this file we have 3 different forms, one form for displaying the students, one form to register a new students, one form to delete, and another one to update. And all of this one is not a form, this is just the table form, a table format to display. And then we have 4 different functions. You can see here we have 4, one function to display data, one function to insert, one function to delete, one function to update the record. And then we just call every function and then we execute our queries directly. I will update all these codes in the GitHub. You can just feel free to download it, and I will add a few comments, and then you can just update, but make sure you're just changing the password, the database, and based on your local machine. Alright, that's all for this video series. Thank you for your time and I wish you all the best.